I found 10 tips for Clash Royale that are so good that you start to win every single game non-stop and understand everything about it. Well, I've been on a mission for the last 6 months to try and actually understand how Clash Royale works and compile 10 tips that nobody talks about, starting from the easiest to use all the way to the most overpowered and broken tips. Let's say you're in a new game that just started and your opponent uses E-barbs at the bridge first play. Classic mid ladder, I know. You have this starting hand and can easily defend with a wizard and ice golem for no damage. Everything is good now and you can start your game without that guy getting more damage than you. You can continue like nothing ever happened. Yeah, no shot. Most people at this point would let the wizard die here because it's 1 HP and useless. But look what happens if you put goblins for 2 elixir in front of the wizard in this situation. That's right, these regular goblins have so much more power now, all because of a 1 HP wizard. What this play that we just did right here does is to essentially play goblins for 2 elixir that are worth more than 2 elixir and are harder to defend. It's like you pay something for 2 of whatever currency and you get more than 2. All of that basically for free. The wizard was still alive. This is free value that you can just take. It's not gonna be always like this every time though. Sometimes this can win you the game if he messes up. But let's go over the next 2 tips. The tips that you can use in order to get this, free elixir. Yeah, it is basically what it sounds like. These tips don't always work for every type of deck, but even if not to the fullest, these 2 tips are really strong. You're now a P.E.K.K.A player. I know, great start. The game has begun and your opponent plays a bandit in the back. Now, you shouldn't always act because of this. It is related to the next tip, but if you play a P.E.K.K.A in the back on the same lane, the bandit is first of all dead, but is also just free. When they eventually meet up, the bandit will dash on the P.E.K.K.A and die, and your P.E.K.K.A goes without anything. Now you have a full P.E.K.K.A alive and he has to defend it with 3 less elixir from the bandit. A more complicated case is if instead of using a bandit, the opponent plays witch in the back and you follow up with a P.E.K.K.A. Instead of using lightning to kill the witch, for example, you can wait for when she comes closer and play a wizard. Then of course the witch will target the P.E.K.K.A like normal, and instead of placing a lightning and losing 6 elixir, you now play a wizard that stays alive, meaning the opponent has to deal with both, and you get a free wizard. That's the first tip for free elixir, the simpler one. Let's look at the other. You play a P.E.K.K.A in the back and the opponent responds with an X-bow and an immediate Tesla on the other lane. What you should do in this specific case is not defend the X-bow and the Tesla, but instead start supporting your P.E.K.K.A on the other lane. Now, I would only do it because you played both X-bow and Tesla, but for this time, if you ignore that lane, the opponent has to defend the P.E.K.K.A with 10 less elixir and you can still support it, aka the opponent is completely cooked. So these tips work best for beatdown and to understand the game, but they are still very useful in other decks. But let's go over the next tip, a tip that is one of the most important ever that you need to understand and get used to as soon as possible. It's called elixir counting. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you first hear elixir counting, you think about doing it literally. Counting the elixir of your opponent so you can know 100% how much they have sounds really hard to do, and you shouldn't really do that. Instead, what elixir counting is by looking at what you play versus what your opponent plays. If you play a card in the back, then the opponent does the same thing and they kill each other. Since they are at about the same elixir, you know that your opponent doesn't have that much more than you. But if, for example, we use tip 2 and the opponent feeds your P.E.K.K.A free troops, that means that they wasted a ton and you are up elixir. It's all about getting it naturally done, and it will help you win and understand the game 10 trillion times better. So let's go over a tip that uses that to the fullest extent. This tip is about when to spam and when to play in the back. It's all based on elixir counting, meaning you have to know that first. Let's imagine you place a Sparky in the back and the opponent plays P.E.K.K.A into it. When they meet at the bridge, the opponent messes up slightly and feeds while your Sparky stays alive with a few cycle cards. At this point, if you know elixir counting well, you would know that you are up a ton of elixir and the opponent is not. So what I'm saying is while you're at that state, instead of playing normally, what you do is play extremely aggressive. Now I will talk about soon about what cards and how you should do that, but you absolutely cannot play passive at that state. You need to make sure that if you're up a ton of elixir, you do not miss your chance and just spam your opponent. Now let's look at another situation. When you don't have an elixir advantage. At this case, instead of playing aggressive, you should play passive and put stuff in the back and mostly not expensive, because if not, you would just let your opponent get free elixir from tip 2. This next one is also related to elixir counting and is what I like to call offensive value versus defensive. It actually splits the cards in the game into 2 categories: cards with more offensive value and cards with more defensive value. For example, Hunter is a defensive card and Hog Rider is offensive, but how do you use that info to your advantage? Let's say you are up 5 elixir because your opponent made a mistake or you've used tips 2 and 3. Instead of attacking with Zappies, that is a card with defensive value, what you should do is attack with a Hog Rider and maybe skeletons behind it, because Hog Rider has much more offensive value. Of course, every single situation is different, but that thing still applies for almost anything. You will defend a Mega Knight with an Inferno Tower, but if you're up 6 Elixir, you're not gonna play an Inferno Tower at the bridge for no reason. No, that would just be stupid. Instead, you will attack with a Goblin Giant, for example, that has offensive value. But what if I told you that there is a way to completely eliminate offensive value cards? Yeah, this one is quite broken. This next tip is mostly about defense. Your opponent has just played a Sparky in the back. Now, Sparky is a unique case. If you pair it up with a tank, it has a lot of offensive value, but without anything, it's useless. So what you can do here is to put stuff on the other lane that the opponent is forced to defend. You can still use tip 3 to ignore, but for that you need to make sure you place offensive value cards and not wizard at the bridge. If the opponent ignores the push, it's a tower trade, which isn't that bad for you, and if you see that he does respond to your stuff, that makes him waste all of his elixir, and now the Sparky has 0 offensive value. Yeah, just place skeletons on it and it will completely take it out. What about a more complex tip? Let's say you're in a game and the left tower is much weaker. The opponent plays a minor plus bats on your right side and you want to defend it with a Mother Witch. Of course, if you're at the same elixir, it is mostly a bad play and you can use tip 2 for free elixir, but if you decide to play the Mother Witch on the left side, what will happen is that you can defend the bats, then ignore the minor with tip 3 to get plus 3 elixir for offense, and now the opponent has to defend the pigs with at least 3 elixir too. Now, if the left side tower wasn't the weaker tower, should you still do this play? The answer is yes. It makes your opponent be at an elixir disadvantage because he has to defend the pigs now. If you decide to play Mother Witch on the same lane of the pigs, the opponent can defend both and get free elixir back. Now, I don't know how much this exact situation will happen to you, but it is pretty similar with a bunch of other ranged troops, like Musketeer for example, and especially with Princess. But now we have the last 2 tips, the nastiest ones on my list, starting with how to win games by spell cycling. And let me tell you, this is actually really easy. There are only 2 rules you need to know for this. You should mostly use Earthquake, Lightning, Rocket and Fireball, and never use Void or Goblin Curse. And the second rule is to only spell cycle when you are up elixir. You see how everything is connecting? If you are up 6 elixir and can't break through their difference in triple, what's the problem with throwing a 6 elixir rocket on the tower? Now, there is another way to do it, but it is pretty complicated and very risky to use. It's when you know you can get free elixir so you can afford throwing a rocket knowing you would get it back, but I won't get into that. And finally, the last tip of the video, one of the most important ones, and also the first tip you should ever use, you need to focus on one single deck. Yeah, so you know how everyone in every single Clash Royale tips and tricks video is all about this one magical thing. Just learn as much of the timing and placements as you can, is what they say. Every single YouTuber always talks about timing and placements, which I'll admit will make you better at Clash Royale, but what I'm saying is that you should focus on one deck and learn the interactions for it, know all of the timing and placements to not make mistakes, just the good interactions, and you should be fine with this side. So now you can use all of these tips that I showed in the video, and hopefully if you do it right, you will win more Clash Royale games, and most importantly, understand how the game works. So subscribe if you want to win a 5-star lucky drop in your next game.